Welcome to the programme. Tonight, the US suspends military aid to Ukraine. British historian Simon Sharma gives me his analysis.
This is one of those days of massive historical importance, world historical importance. It is a day of horrible infamy.
And with the footy season about to start, why you might not be able to watch your favourite team on TV this year. But first, in a major shift, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, says he's open to considering sending troops to Ukraine as part of an international peacekeeping mission. Here's 7:30's political editor, Laura Tingle.
Have you said thank you once?
You think that if you will speak very loudly about the war,
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country's in big trouble.
Even the natural order of political positions in Australia seem to have been upended by the extraordinary events in the White House 4 days ago. This morning, the Prime Minister had a very different message on Ukraine to the one he has very carefully taken for some months, at the cost of being criticised for being weak on such issues, signalling he was open to joining the coalition of the willing, being spearheaded by the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer.
There's discussion at the moment about potential peacekeeping, and from my government's perspective, we're open to consideration of any proposals going forward. Australia has historically played an important role in areas including in Africa, in Cyprus, in a range of peacekeeping areas. We want to make sure that the illegal, immoral actions of Russia are not rewarded, and that Vladimir Putin and his designs, which are imperialistic, not just on Ukraine but on other countries, are not rewarded or encouraged.
For once, the Prime Minister seemed to be taking a more assertive foreign policy position than the opposition leader.
In terms of whether we should have boots on the ground in Ukraine, I don't support that. I think the Europeans have that task.
With regard to the US is an important ally of Australia. That remains the case. It's an alliance between our nations. With regard to Australia's foreign policy, Australia determines our foreign policy. We do it in Australia's national interest, and it is in Australia's national interest to stand with Ukraine, and that's what my government is doing.
It's one thing for the Europeans to stand up for Ukraine, but another for Australia, particularly given the past caution about taking a different position to President Trump on almost anything. And while the government's language may reverberate in Washington, at home, opinion polls pointing to a likely minority government suggest views on the crossbench may need to be taken into consideration. The MP for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel, says it is time for some plain talking with our ally.
I don't think it's sustainable to just hope that this situation will go away and that we can walk on eggshells around Donald Trump for the next 4 years in the hope that he won't impose tariffs on our key exports because we defy him in some way.
Not everyone has been quite so diplomatic, like West Australian Premier Roger Cook.
JD Vance is a
knob.
In the United States, there is now an increasing focus on the domestic political and economic cost of the Trump modus operandi. President Trump's approval ratings have been on a steady decline since his inauguration, and his aggression towards Canada has brought Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party back from the political dead ahead of the Canadian election. A share market shocked by Trump's tactics, as well as his move on tariffs against Mexico and Canada, sold off sharply this morning, with the Nasdaq falling 2.6%. American business and consumers are being made anxious about the real-world cost of Trump's international aggression. The impact of the second Trump presidency on Australian politics comes through the potential economic threat of tariffs, its impact on our strategic outlook, but also through its influence on the nature of language and tactics used domestically. There are still Trumpian echoes in some of the political strategy being taken by Peter Dutton's coalition, including a further escalation in his targeting of the public service as a source of waste and resentment.
There are public servants at the moment in Canberra who are refusing to go back to work, and they're being paid in some cases over $200,000 a year. And I just think people here who are struggling, some families who have taken up second and third jobs just to pay their mortgage under this government. Any Australian, let me know if it's more efficient for you to deal with the Canberra bureaucracy having 36,000 more public servants.
For its part, Labor is focusing its policy messages on very traditional topics like education.
This will provide a $4.8 billion injection from the Commonwealth into New South Wales public schools over the next decade. This is the largest ever federal injection of funds into New South Wales schools ever by any government.
Back in the foreign policy zone, Zoe Daniel says recent events show Australia has to think more broadly than the US alliance.
With the mercurial behaviour of the US president, we do have to make alternative alliances, and those alliances are likely to lie in Europe. If our plan A, or indeed our only plan, has been to align ourselves with the Americans, we need to think about whether that plan is still fit for purpose. And to be clear, I'm not saying we don't need that alliance. Of course we do. It's critically important that we continue to have a relationship with the US. But at the moment, we really have all our eggs in one basket when it comes to AUKUS, our national security positioning, and indeed even the way that US troops rotate into Australian territory, for example.
How does Daniel see the crossbench influencing foreign policy in a minority government?
So part of my role as a member of the crossbench is to call out uncomfortable truths that the major parties don't want to, and to provoke conversations about things that they're not really keen to have. And as you know, AUKUS, for example, is bipartisan policy, and I think for that reason it's had very little scrutiny, and anyone who's put their head up to criticise it has been shot down within the public arena. With the direction that the world is going in right now and the shifting nature of the landscape, it's a conversation that has to be had.
President Trump caused a sharp escalation in the US breach with Ukraine today, immediately suspending a pipeline of $1 billion worth of military aid to the country, as well as cutting off funds for Zelensky's government to buy military hardware from US defence companies. The clear winner from the decision is Vladimir Putin. Historian Sir Simon Sharma is in Australia presenting an oration at the Adelaide Writers' Festival. I spoke to him earlier. Simon Sharma, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you for having me.
How profound is this moment in historic terms, a decision by the White House that so clearly benefits Russia?
This is one of those days of massive historical importance, world historical importance. It is a day of horrible infamy. It feels like being around the day the Munich Agreement was signed between Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. It's world overturning, really. It could be something that signals a catastrophic endgame for the defence of the democracies. And this all sounds very histrionic, I know, and historians are usually, possibly not me, dry and crusty, sceptical and cool-tempered. This is not a day to be cool-tempered. This is not a day to have business as usual. Hey, news outlets everywhere, you know, 10 minutes of cyclone, OK, you should, but this is really monstrously destructive.
Explain why.
Well, because I think ever since, really, Franklin Roosevelt, in particular the United States, even when the United States had to wait for Pearl Harbor to actually join the war, the United States proclaimed itself to be the arsenal of democracy, and Lend-Lease, the provision of munitions materials to embattled Britain was incredibly important. And ever since then, you can signpost it, the Berlin airlift in 1948, Jack Kennedy's speech about the protection of freedom. The one thing that would not change between Democratic and Republican administrations, Ronald Reagan, as we sit here and speak, Sarah, is spinning in his tomb, is that they may not be on the same page as the Europeans, but the sense of America's moral integrity and decency in the world was committed to the defence of democracy against totalitarianism. That has been brushed aside today.
And yet you raise FDR, and that brings me obviously to the question that this vein of American isolationism is not new. It existed then. There were powerful political forces in the US who wanted to stop FDR helping Churchill at the outbreak of war.
But Lindbergh did not win the election. You know, the campaign that was premised on America First did not win the election.
But are these the same? Is this the same vein? Are these the same political forces essentially reborn?
They're not entirely dissimilar. Again, you know, one should be allergic to making cheap 1930s analogies. Even I am. Yeah,
I hope I wasn't.
Me too. But the sense in which actually you reward naked aggression with extortionate demands for capitulation is absolutely what Munich was about. And of course, one thing we know, this is not controversial between Republicans, Democrats, most of us lucky enough to live in the free world. When you do reward aggression, it guarantees another round of aggression. And we can tell today, tonight, you know, people in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Moldova and so on, I hope they won't be shaking in their shoes, but they will be in a sense of sense of desperate trouble and dismay.
Explain to us how what the Americans are saying, and to be clear, of course, it's, for the moment, it's a pause on funding to Ukraine, but let's assume that it goes ahead, even just the threat. How does Putin see this? How does it change? Does it change his level of ambition?
Putin probably is in pain from laughing so much, you know, really, actually. He could not have conceivably supposed that, in effect, he would have recruited something very close to an alliance, or at least American foreign policy would actually converge so deeply with his fundamental attempt to really force a Ukrainian capitulation. He couldn't remotely have thought that would happen, actually. And it seems to be that Ukrainian capitulation has been dropped into his hands without him having to spend any more blood or treasure. The pause thing is significant. Donald Trump, remember, has actually paused military help to Ukraine before in 2019. And guess what? The condition then was the Ukrainians supply dirt that would compromise Biden's political future. This is shocking. This is much more serious in that what Donald Trump says, if we're, that may or may not be rowing back, is that all military aid will be suspended until Zelensky is, quote, ready for peace. But this is the kind of Munich peace.
Are we seeing, in this case, is this transactional related to Ukraine and perhaps business interests in Russia? Because there's more and more detail coming out about Russia's ambitions if there's a change in the sanctions regime, for example. Right. Is this transactional on the part of Donald Trump, or are we seeing a more profound withdrawal of America into its own sphere and out of Europe and out of perhaps the Indo-Pacific?
It's undoubtedly transactional, but that doesn't actually exclude the possibility that there are deeper, darker, very potent forces which are profoundly isolationist and which think really the whole of American foreign policy should sort of stay clear of imbroglios. I mean, you know, Henry Cabot Lodge, the failure to ratify the Versailles Treaty, America's withdrawal from Europe again, you know, cast an immediate black cloud over the prospects for peace in Europe after the First World War. So it's not like this comes out of absolutely nowhere. And the success of the kind of, you know, Trumpian campaign, really, is to actually make the majority of those who are MAGA loyalists feel, essentially, that the Europeans have nothing to do with their fate or fortune, their prosperity, whatever, that this is sort of like some, you know, foreign distraction, really, which is profoundly un-American. Whereas the peace and strength of the free world has depended on the defence of democracy being the most American thing there possibly could be. Think of all those lives lost on the beaches of Normandy in the war against Japan. It is so profoundly upsetting.
On that profound note, Simon Sharma, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Now, with a view from Europe, the Chief Foreign Affairs commentator for the UK's Financial Times, Gideon Rachman, joins me from London. Gideon Rachman, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks.
How long can Ukraine survive without US military aid?
Well, it's a very open question. I mean, I think we should remember that when Russia invaded, in the full-scale invasion in February 2022, most analysts thought Ukraine would lose within a week, and they didn't. And similarly, there is a lot of doom and gloom, and there's no doubt that America supplies very important things, particularly air defense, Patriot missiles, and also intelligence, because a lot of the Ukraine's ability to target Russian attacking forces comes from American intelligence. But that said, I was in Kiev last week, and one of the really things I learned, I think, is that this war has really been transformed over the last 3 years, and it's about drone warfare. Ukraine produces 1 million drones a year domestically. Some of their military analysts say that it really would be impossible for Russia now to launch an assault of the kind they did 3 years ago, simply because massing troops, massing tanks, they become targets of these drones. Russia lost 400,000 troops killed or wounded last year and gained 0.5% of Ukrainian territory. And that's partly because of these drones. So for me, it comes down to, can Ukraine continue to fight the drone warfare without US intelligence behind it? And the Ukrainians say they think they can find workarounds. If they can, they'll stay in the fight.
Does it depend on them having access to Elon Musk's Starlink, however, to run that drone program?
Yeah, that Starlink is very important. But again, I don't have the technical knowledge to know whether the Ukrainians were kind of whistling in the dark, but some of them said to me, yes, it would be a big blow if we lost Starlink, but we've already begun to think about it. We do have workarounds. There are some European alternatives. They can use the drones using GPS, which actually, incidentally, is also controlled from the United States. But so they think, they hope that they can continue to fight the drone war even without Starlink. But I think they have to assume the worst, that Musk will cut them off.
Now, if we think about the air defence, and we saw what happened when there was a pause last year when Trump put pressure on Congress and there was a pause in funding, there was an impact on air defence. Can Europe quickly, or NATO countries, fill the gap in Ukraine's air defence?
Not quickly. I think that's the problem. Patriot missile batteries are very expensive and already spread quite thin. A lot of them were used protecting Israel against Iran. And if there are no more of those coming, then yes, Ukraine is vulnerable. And particularly, I think you would expect Putin to go after the cities, but particularly to go after energy infrastructure. I think the plan is to kind of plunge Ukraine into the dark, deprive them of electricity. I mean, one tiny silver lining is we're heading into summer now rather than winter, so the kind of worst temperatures won't be there. But still, yeah, they would be very vulnerable. And I think it was notable that Keir Starmer, after the summit here on Sunday, said that there's going to be big investment in building air defense for Ukraine out of Belfast, but that doesn't happen overnight.
To what extent, given today's news, there seemed to be some settling after the meeting in Europe? Does this throw things into turmoil again? Is this just going to be days and days of turmoil?
Yeah, I think days and days and months and maybe years, as Simon Sharma was implying. But I think that it's interesting because if you talk to European officials, British officials on background, they could see the direction this was heading. And they've already begun to think about, well, what if America pulls the plug? But knowing that might happen and then it actually happening are different things. There is still a shock when it actually happens. And because I think one way that a European put it to me, and I think it's close to the British approach as well, is we know where America's heading, but we need to keep them in the game as long as possible because Europe doesn't have the ability to step up and completely replace America, either sort of manufacturing capability or the money, frankly, to do it overnight. So the hope was to elongate this process, but we may find that we have to do it much more quickly than we thought. When
they say they know where this is going, where does it go? Where does it end up, particularly in relation to the US and Russia?
Well, when I say we know where it's going, we can see the general direction of travel. I think there's still an element of incredulity that America really is turning its back on the Western alliance, but I think that's where it's going. There's already speculation that, Musk, for example, somebody on Twitter said the US should withdraw from NATO, and Musk said, yeah, we should. He also said we should withdraw from the UN. So those things, which would have been completely unthinkable a couple of months ago, are now very much being thought. And I think even if the US doesn't technically withdraw from NATO, that NATO's kind of credibility is shot because it relies on the idea that when it comes to it, America would fight in Europe. And who would believe that now? I certainly don't believe that a Trump administration would come to the defense of the Baltics, even if they haven't technically ruled it out. So the Europeans have to start adapting to this new world very fast.
What does it mean for countries like Australia, just immediately in terms of weaponry and so on for Ukraine? Should Australia be providing more munitions as quickly as they can, Bushmasters, other equipment? Should countries like Australia, countries in the Indo-Pacific, be stepping up?
Well, that's a decision for Australia. I mean, I was very struck by the clip you had of Albanese saying that, Australia would get involved in a peacekeeping force. And that's a very bold thing for an Australian Prime Minister to say. Even here in Britain, people are saying, wow, are we really going to put troops right up against the Russians? You're much further away. I think people would be, deeply appreciative if Australia were to do it. And I think it's also bold, not just in terms of the pure military risks, but also because it's sided, the Western alliance is ripped down the middle now. And Albanese, by doing that, is saying, well, we're on the European side of this particular argument in purely kind of terms of who gives Australia most security. Well, it's the US, it's not Europe. And America has, Australia's made this deep commitment to AUKUS, which is a decades-long project. And I remember, last time I was in Australia, some AUKUS critics were saying to me, is it really wise to make a decades-long commitment to the United States, relying on American reliability when we can see what Trump is like and Trump is coming? And, can you really assume they'll be there? And I think that question is, it applies particularly to AUKUS, but more generally to the alliance. So in some ways, Australia is facing the same kinds of questions that the Europeans are facing. We've built our security around the idea of an American guarantee. Is it still there? Don't know. I mean, you could argue that at least Australia, benefits from the fact that the Trump administration seems to see China as the real adversary. So if they stick with that, then it may be that they continue to stick with Australia for now. But I wouldn't even guarantee that Trump doesn't want to do a deal with China at some point.
Yes, when you say they see China as the real adversary, does Trump, do the people closest to him, we know there are some people in the administration who are still very focused on that as the primary threat. Does Trump see Taiwan as central to American interests anymore?
Well, that's the thing. I think that one of the things about this administration is because Trump is perceived as having triumphed over his enemies, nobody is prepared to push back against him. So in the end, it comes down to what's in this one man's head. And it is true that he's surrounded by a bunch of people whose rhetoric on China is very hawkish. But if Trump turned around tomorrow and said, Xi's a great guy, I'm going to do a deal with him, and I don't care about Taiwan, they would all fall into line. I've no doubt about it. And I think that Trump, we know, has said in the past that, Trump respects size. That's why he respects Russia and doesn't really respect Ukraine. He said, Taiwan is like a microdot compared to China. What are we doing? So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he trades Taiwan away. But there is the question of the semiconductors. Without those, Americans' electronics industry and tech industry is in big trouble. So they have to find a way of getting those Taiwanese semiconductors and not handing them over to China. That's really Taiwan's silicon shield, as they say.
The whole world dependent on what's inside one man's head. Gideon Rachman, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.
The AFL kicks off this week, and while the games in Queensland have been postponed due to the cyclone, broadcasters are still promising more coverage than ever. But on free-to-air TV, Saturday games will be a lot harder to find on the schedule. Norman Hammond explains why.
For decades, it's been a rite of passage for millions of AFL fans on Saturday. Turn on free-to-air TV and find the footy. But when this season starts, it won't be there.
Kick a big one for us. Oh, that's a good one.
Taylor, Clint, Lily, and Heath are excited at this time of year. Footy is back.
You open?
But not on free-to-air on Saturday, thanks to the AFL's new broadcast deal.
Oh!
Growing up, that's all. I hung for the Saturdays, and not having it this year, I just found out. It's awful. I don't like it.
For much of this year, Channel 7 won't carry AFL games on Saturday. If this family wants to watch then, they'll have to pay.
Nick, 35, goal!
at this time where inflation's up, a lot of people's not going to be able to afford that. So, yeah, it's pretty crappy.
You know, the place to watch footy live on Saturdays is Fox Footy.
The AFL's new broadcast deal gives Fox Footy and Kayo exclusive rights for Saturday AFL games for big chunks of the season, when there will be no free-to-air option.
Pretty much everything these days is now, if you want to use it or see or watch, you got to pay, and everything's turning to that. And I thought football would be one thing that we'd be able to enjoy without having to pay.
Channel 7 is promising more free-to-air footy content than ever, with 23 games over the season on Thursday night, as well as Friday and Sunday. But look again, and Saturday is missing. In Victoria, Tasmania and the Northern Territory, fans won't be able to watch live or delayed AFL games for most of the season. In the rest of the country, there will be no live free-to-air Saturday games for at least the first 8 or 10 rounds, depending on where you live. Pay services Fox Footy and Kayo will have exclusive rights. Media analyst Mark C. Scott says the reason Sunday footy has disappeared comes down to one thing: money.
It's a $4.5 billion deal, and it's going to take us through to the 2031 season.
Carving out an exclusive pay TV broadcast window on Saturdays means big revenue for the AFL.
It's a 4-on-1 inside 50, and Neil goes bang.
Do you think most footy fans here realise yet the implication of what's going to happen this year?
I think for a majority of Australians, that first game when they turn on Saturday night, they're going to be questioning, actually, has the footy started? And that's going to be a big change.
Access to Gate 5 is via the pathway directly to the right.
At this pre-season match, the end of free-to-air Saturday footy for much of the season was news to many.
The older generation don't know about this. It's just the younger ones. So, yeah, it should be more advertised.
Well, you grew up with it. I don't know what else to say, mate. You know what I mean? Everything, you got to pay for everything these days, you know, the price of living, the price of everything, mate.
We're ready to play? Beautiful. Here we go.
At the AFL season launch yesterday, the league explained that on free-to-air TV, Saturday's loss is Thursday night's gain.
The amount of games on free-to-air nationally this year will be exactly the same as what it's always been. But what we have done is listen to the fans, in particular with the call for more Thursday night games. And so what we've seen is games move from Saturday night free-to-air to Thursday night.
The AFL's broadcast deal was struck more than 2 years ago. The government's anti-siphoning list limits which sports can be put behind a paywall. But the Federal Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, says it's important to clarify what the anti-siphoning list does and doesn't do.
It doesn't guarantee that free-to-air broadcasters will take up every right that is offered to them by a code that may be on the anti-siphoning list. It doesn't guarantee that every game will be shown for free or live. And it also enables the codes and their media partners to construct their own deals.
Now, I started playing in the 70s.
Mick Malthouse has been around footy for 50 years as a player, coach and broadcaster. In that time, he's seen the AFL utterly transform.
Nothing stays the same. Nothing ever stays the same.
But he believes Saturday footy on free-to-air TV holds a special place for AFL fans.
You think, are we losing some of our tradition? Are we losing? There's a lot of people do not have Foxtel nor Kayo. They rely heavily on free-to-air television. We've got people in nursing homes, in hospitals. We've got people that are elderly.
Do you think the AFL needs to be a little bit careful here?
Without one shadow of doubt. The care factor here is remembering the game is for the people. We've got to be very careful that we don't prioritise things in front of that.
Second-tier state leagues playing on historic grounds could be one of the big winners in all of this.
There it is on its way, and the goal umpire moves to the middle. It's first blood to Port Melbourne, 1 minute after commencement of play.
VFL clubs like Port Melbourne have been around for 150 years, and this ground is set for a return to the spotlight, with Channel 7 broadcasting state leagues on Saturdays to fill the appetite for free-to-air footy.
Let's go this way, come on.
State league games on TV are at least something, but they're not what this family looks forward to.
Australia, where when I was growing up, the slogan was Australia's a free country. It's definitely going from Australia's a free country to Australia's a paid country.
That's the programme for this evening. Thank you very much for your company. Good night.